Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to our final and most exciting sessions, cross-border jurisdiction challenges, high fines and extraterritorial scope with our data privacy. And today we have Astrid Gobardhan, the Senior Legal Counsel from Global Privacy Program of Rabobank. Now, Astrid is actually based in the Netherlands. It is 6 a.m. in the morning over there. Thank you, Astrid, for coming on board, sharing your best practices and also insight on data privacy. Now, data privacy, I know that, in Netherlands, based in EU, with the GDPR, is actually very, very important aspect of a lot of business and compliance for compliance professional. But in Asia, in Hong Kong, a number of businesses that are involved in EU or doing business in Europe also basically now take a very important stand and putting a lot of emphasis, not just GDPR, but also CCPA with the California recent Data Privacy Act as well. I know that you're going to walk us through that, so I'm going to basically start. Just to let you guys know that if you have any questions, again, you can basically say something nice. Astrid has some issue on the PPT, so I will basically show her PPT. And if, let's just say, there is a delay in clicking, please forgive me. Astrid, 1 second. Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm here to tell you something about some data privacy legislation in different countries. I've picked a few countries from my thought that you are dealing with or coming from, which also will show you that there are some really challenges cross-border. And I will end with some statistics about the fines in Europe, according to the GDPR. So let's start with the next slide. Let's start with, can you please move on to the next slide? I think there's a delay. Yeah, this is the overview. It's a slide from Morris and Foster. It's an overview of the data protection legislation, where you can see that in red, you have some omnibus privacy laws existing in those countries. A little bit light red, you will find some sectoral states privacy laws specific. And in the yellow part, you will find some limited privacy provisions, while in the green parts, there are no laws, no data protection law, which is mainly in Africa, as you can see. So all over the world, it's almost getting red. And you can imagine, due to the COVID crisis, it may increase or even get more deep red, having a more omnibus privacy laws. I don't want to talk too much about the COVID crisis, but as you can imagine, data protection is getting is getting a lot of attention these days because of the COVID crisis and employee data. You have issues around, especially when you have an international company with different locations in different countries with different data protection legislation. You can counter some challenges about how do I deal with my employee data? What if I want to measure, for example, the temperature of my employees? Is that allowed? So that may be allowed in India, but not in Singapore or in another country in which you're located in. So you can face quite some challenges these days to run your business, and also during these days you have much more governmental impact. You can imagine that certain governments want to impose restrictions which may have data privacy impact. For example, the use of an app to monitor where you're going, where citizens are going, and with whom you've been in contact with, and that can also breach your privacy, and that may have impact if you have multiple jurisdictions in your enterprise. It may be the case that you can have to deal with different legislations, and it's quite a challenge to adhere to all of them at once. So having an overview of what is really key data elements in each of the countries is very important. So having said that, I want you to take you through a few countries. So if you could go to the next slide. I want to start with Hong Kong, since we are doing this live stream from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, you will see a much more omnibus law, which concerns all personal data. So it's not sector driven. The key legislation in Hong Kong is the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance. And we expect that the Hong Kong government to strengthen this law, because it's reviewing together with the PDPO, the PCPD, how to increase this legislation. So we do expect that there will be a material amendments to the PDPO in the next 2 months. The Hong Kong regulator is very active and is very involved in protecting of personal data. And you can see that the Hong Kong legislation applies only to organizations located in jurisdictions, whilst, as you know, the GDPR has a extraterritorial impact, and that's not yet the case in Hong Kong. So if we go to the next slide, you will see what has happened with respect to the fines and the attention of the regulator in Hong Kong. You can see that according to the PCPD's annual report from the last 2 years, 30% of all the complaints was about information technology. And there was a number of complaints about the disclosure or leakage of personal data on the internet. And the Hong Kong regulator is very much active when it receives complaints. So this is actually the trigger for the Hong Kong regulator to act upon. And other major subjects of complaints include collection of Hong Kong identity card number copies, and subsequent use, human resource management, and direct marketing. Well, you can see that over 70% of the complaints that were received by the PCPD concerned private organizations, and the majority of which included banking and finance institutions, property management companies, and transportation companies. So major work conducted by the PCPD during those last 2 years included compliance investigations on airline and telecommunications companies. And that was very much focused on security incidents. You can imagine that these companies hold quite some sensitive personal data, and the attention of this regulator in Hong Kong was increased on that. They also conducted a compliance check on shopping mall membership programs, which is quite a big thing in Hong Kong, which was in response to concerns about personal data collection during online promotion activities. But also because the main target clients seems to be minors. And as you may know, data from minors are considered as sensitive data, so the focus on that was increased. So there were 6 cases who were referred to the Hong Kong police force for criminal investigation in the last 2 years. And they were all direct market related cases. And we do expect that the Hong Kong regulator will continue having a huge focus on data protection because it wants to strengthen its legislation. So if we're moving to the next slide, I'm going to take you through the situation in Singapore with respect to data protection. In Singapore, you will find some omnibus and sector-specific legislation, and that sector-specific legislation is focused on telecoms, financial services, and public sector. The key legislation there is the Personal Data Protection Act, and we expect that there's going to be a mandatory data breach notification regime, which is also the case in the GDPR. There's a data breach notification. You have to notify data breach within 72 hours. So not sure how the Singapore data breach notification is going to look like. But it is proposed. It has not yet been released, and there's no official guidance when it will be enacted. But there are these amendments may be implemented in the next 12 months. The Singapore regulator is a moderately active regulator, and the legislation applies to organizations located in this jurisdiction. So, contrary to the GDPR, also the Singapore's legislation does not have an extraterritorial impact. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that in the past 18 months, we have seen a marked increase in the PDCB enforcement decisions. So in particular, we see that the decisions have been focused on breaches of the protection obligations under the PDPA with respect to implementing reasonable security arrangements. So also here, security data breach have a huge focus in order to prevent unauthorized access, collection, use, disclosure, similar risks. So it's very much focused on the internet vulnerabilities and the failure to follow the guidance issued by the PDPC. You can see in Singapore that in terms of priorities, the PDPC has increasingly shifted its focus towards an accountability approach. So accountability is a big topic in GDPR. It was actually introduced in Europe via the GDPR as a major principle, which is really about being able to demonstrate as an organization that you adhere to the data privacy legislation. And we see in Singapore that the focus of the regulator has shifted towards an accountability approach with a greater awareness of the risks surrounding the unauthorized collection, use, and personal data, especially on in the internet. So it is quite surprising also to see that what GDPR is taken very much as a standard throughout the world, but in some cases, like the CCP, the California Privacy Act, but also in other countries where countries are developing data protection legislation on certain topics, you see that there's even much more stringent requirements and rules applicable to data protection. So if we go to the next slide, I'll take you through Malaysia. So in Malaysia, you also have some omnibus and sector-specific data protection rules, and those sector-specific rules are focused on aviation, utilities, insurance, and banking sectors. You will find a list of the key legislation in this slide. And also here we do expect that the Malaysian Ministry of Communications and Multimedia is looking to tighten and strengthen the Personal Data Protection Act. So there are no bills or proposals issued yet, but you do see that there is a need from the ministry to tighten and strengthen the legislation also here in Malaysia. In Malaysia, we have a moderately active regulator. Also here, you will see that the legislation is applicable to organizations which are located in this jurisdiction without having an extraterritorial effect. So if you go to what has been the focus of the Malaysian authority in the next slide, and you will see that in 2018, there was a recruitment agency that was charged for processing personal data without a valid certificate. So you need to have a valid certificate issued by the commissioner, and that was lacking in this case. That was actually a significant fine in Malaysia. And you can see that based on the published news report from 2017 to October 2019, 5 individuals had been charged and fined for a breach of confidential personal data. And another 7 were required to pay compounds amounting 80,000 Malaysian rupees. And however, as you can see, the focus has been on data breaches as well in this country. And because it concerns individuals, no further details were disclosed in relation to these breaches. But also here you can see there's a lot of focus on data breaches. And we expect the DPPP to prioritize the enforcement in the future to ensure the security and protection of personal data in light of recent data leakage cases. So again, a lot of focus on data breaches and leakage case. I think I have a question from Andy Wong. With data usage storage creeping up via indirect means, what's the cross-border deterrent for non-resident companies legislatively other than local legislation? Yeah, so that's indeed quite a challenge if you have to adhere to local legislation, but also to legislation that is applicable in the countries that you're operating in. So what's best practice in these cases is to go for the most stringent rule. So then at least you adhere to the safest legislation, which is best for the individuals. So that's mostly the approach taken, to go for to make a comparison between those different legislation and go for the most stringent regime. I hope that answers your question, Andy. If not, please pop up again. So moving on to Australia. In Australia, we have some omnibus legislation, but also a lot of sector-specific legislation. I will show you an overview of the key legislation in Australia, which is quite a lot. But what we expect in Asia, in Australia even more, is the open banking scheme introduced by the Consumer Data Rights Act, which will be expanded to cover consumer data for credit and debit cards and deposit, transaction accounts as from the 1st of July 2020, and mortgage and personal loan accounts from the 1st of November 2020. In Australia, we see that the ACCC will finalize these Consumer Data Rights Act rules, which will reflect these changes. And it's consulting now on how best to facilitate participation of third-party services providers in open banking. And we expect to have some additional rules for intermediaries and storage of CDR data. So that ties in a little bit in your question as well, Andy. So this is something that we're going to expect, and throughout 2020, the Australian government will be consulting with the industry again on future directions of the Consumer Data Rights Act. We see a moderately active regulator in Australia. Also here, it only applies to organizations located in a jurisdiction, not having an extraterritorial impact. So if you go to the next slide, here you will have an overview of the key legislation in Australia on privacy. As you can see, it's quite a lot. That's the Omnibus Law. And you can also see a very health sector specific Commonwealth law, which is very much focused on the health sector. I can imagine that the COVID crisis will increase legislation in this area. So if you go to the next slide, you will see the telecommunications specific legislation in Australia. It's quite a lot. Also about workplace surveillance devices, which will also have an impact if we look at apps and during the COVID crisis and other surveillance techniques that governments wants to put in place. The next slide, that's the last slide about the legislation in Australia. This is just a gathering of various other laws dealing with aspects of national security in Australia, which may have implications for data security. That's a list of it. So that's the legislation in Australia, which is quite a lot. So there's a lot of attention in Australia on data protection. If you go to the next slide, it's only increasing and getting more and more. Can you please go to the next slide? So this is what happened in the corporate plan from in 2019 and 20 provides information about the regulator's focus and the planned activities for the near future. And the key priorities for 2019 to 2023 are advancing online privacy protections. So again, online is very much in focus. Influencing and upholding privacy and information access right frameworks. So this really goes into data subject rights. It's very similar to the GDPR, where data subject rights have a prominent place. Encouraging and supporting proactive release of government-held information and a contemporary approach to regulation. So overall, the expectation is that the recently announced reforms, including the increase in penalties under this Privacy Act, will result in increased enforcement actions by the regulator moving forward. So it's expected also here that the regulator will take an interest in privacy compliance, where it is perceived that organizations are misleading consumers about privacy matters. And in Australia, we see a lot of focus on spam compliance. So this is the tendency, the trends in Australia. Moving on to Taiwan, our last country for today, where we see omnibus legislation. The key legislation here is the Personal Data Protection Act and the Information and Communication Security Management Act. we do expect that the National Development Council is planning to amend this Privacy Act in this year. We see a moderately active regulator in Taiwan, and also here it applies to organizations located in that jurisdiction. So what happened in Taiwan? Next slide, please. And moving forward, where we see that the financial authority in Taiwan is very active in the enforcement of the Privacy Act. And we expect that the financial authority is going to continue being active. And we will see more enforcement in retail, healthcare, medical, and telco industries. That is where the focus of the Taiwanese regulators are on. And so we do expect some more enforcement in that. So yes, moving on to the next slide, and that's my last one. I think my time is almost up. Here you can see this is a slide which I prepared from enforcementtracker.com. I think it's a very insightful website where you can follow the fines that are imposed in Europe due to the GDPR. It's from statistics administered by CMS. It's a big firm. So what's very interesting, as you can see, is how the fines are increasing in Europe. This has been tracked as from July 2018. The GDPR was already active and enforced, and you can see how in each year the sum of the fines, so the up to month, but also the number of the fines up to months, have been increasing till today. There are quite a lot of the focus of the regulators on data protection, and it's only increasing. So obviously the regulators in Europe needed a bit of time to get up to speed with the GDPR, get their organizations up to speed, enough resources, enough budget in order to do some more enforcement. Would the slide be available for download too? Dropped out. I think these slides are going to be made available to all of you. But just to close this presentation with, I think if you look at the fines in Europe, they are only increasing. That's for sure, and it's increasing a lot. And as you know, the GDPR has a extraterritorial focus, which means that if you are targeting as a international company or not as an international company, if you're a small company, but the moment you target the data from EU citizens, the GDPR is applicable to you. But also if you act maybe as a processor where you process the data of EU citizens in, let's say, in Taiwan or in India or in Africa, where we haven't seen any data protection legislation in some countries yet, the GDPR is applicable to you. So also the fines will be in scope for you as an organization. So that's something I think you should bear in mind if you have an international organization or when you deal with personal data from EU citizens.
Thank you, Astrid, for the great presentations. If you guys have questions, feel free to ask now and such. While I'm basically, do you have anything to add, Astrid?
I started my presentation with a remark that we do think that there's going to be a lot more attention, if not already, on data protection because of the COVID crisis. which has huge implication on employee data, but also on the data of citizens.
Exactly. But right now, the issue is that a lot of there's a question from Andy. So granted, there is influence from GDPR toward Asia legislation, specifically on personal identifiable metadata. It is likely to make it present in Asia. Is it okay? I can imagine significant compliance costs arising from this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Andy. I think if you look at the burden on organizations for getting compliant, but also staying compliant, the costs of that are increasing a lot. So you do need a strong business case to survive those costs, indeed.
Astrid, so because of remote working, etc., a number of organizations is being hacked, and some of this data has been stolen and resold in the dark market, and then also being reused as well. What implication do you think there is for organization? Can they, are they exempt from this or not really?
No, there's no escape from this. So as you may have seen in my presentation, the attention on especially these topics that you mentioned, the misuse and the use, it's very much increasing by the governments, and that's really a trend, and we don't expect that to be different, especially after COVID. I think it's going to be much more and more and more.
So what can the DPO do now? The Data Privacy Officer do now?
Well, first of all, the Privacy Office, organize yourself very well, especially, given the nature of your organization. And if you're located in different countries, just make sure you track the legislation, the developments in all those specific countries. Make sure you have an overview of all the different legislation, so you're able to meet all those, because there's not one standard, as you have seen. So it would help a lot of companies and the economy if we had just one data protection standard. So if we go back to America, where you see the California Privacy Act, they are thinking about a federal law on privacy to have just one omnibus key legislation in whole America, but that's just America. And then you have a lot of other countries. So India is also working on data protection legislation, where you may have differences. So that makes it difficult for you to operate in different countries. So if you are a privacy office, make sure that you're capable of dealing with that. And that starts with having an overview of all these different legislations.
Okay, last question. Challenges. You also have to work from home now. What is your advice? Astrid, you manage the data privacy for Rabobank. What is your advice with your fellow colleagues that now have to basically doing the same thing as you?
Yeah, so the Rabobank is very much focused on security these days. So we have received a lot of guidelines with respect to making sure you have a safe connection with the applications of the bank. Make sure that, if you're looking into data, no one of your family is looking as well to your screen. So things like that, we have issued a few guidelines which employees need to take into account in order to prevent a data leakage in any form. So the focus is very much on the data leakage and security side these days.
Well, thank you so much. That's basically the final insights and also presentation for today. Thank you, Astrid. I understand it's 6:45 a.m. in Netherlands. Thank you so much for waking up so early to do this. Can we basically give a thank you applause to Astrid, please? Otherwise, you feel too lonely just talking to me alone. We do hope to see you in Netherlands. Actually, we do events in Netherlands, in Amsterdam every year. But obviously, we can't do it now. Ladies and gentlemen, we do events, this particular event live in Hong Kong in November. So please do join us. And I hope to see you again. Thank you so much. Thank you.